Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil.Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. And today's episode is no exception. I really do have two great guests lined up. Now, the National Resilience Framework states that resilience should be a whole society endeavour. And that's our topic for today, whole society. We've touched on it in other episodes. In episode 7, for example, we explored how social value can play a role in helping us to engage with the whole of society. But the concept of whole society comes with its challenges, so let's dive in. My guests today are JBA's Toby Jones and Karl Astbury from the Resilient Cities Network. A very warm welcome to you both, chaps, and perhaps you'd like to introduce yourselves. Toby, if you could go first.
Yeah, sure thing. Toby Jones from JBA Consulting. So I've been at JBA for 4 years now. I'm the emergency planning lead. Gives me an opportunity to do all sorts of things from flood response planning to training, exercising for major events, among kind of diagnostic kind of work as well. In the past, I used to work at the Environment Agency, working in flood preparedness and response.
Excellent. Thanks, Toby. And Karl?
Yes, thanks, Phil. Hello, and thank you for having me on this great podcast. My name is Karl Astbury. I'm from the Global Resilient Cities Network, and I work as a lead for climate and health, having previously worked for many years within local government, within Greater Manchester on emergency planning, response and recovery, disaster risk reduction, and all things urban resilience for the city region of Greater Manchester. In my current role, I've been working on a programme called Resilience for Communities, and with the support of the Z Zurich Foundation, and this aims to build and develop community resilience initiatives against climate hazards. So very fitting to this conversation. And in my role as a resilience practitioner, one of my big focuses is on trying to bridge that gap between high level climate strategies and actually what's happening on the ground in our communities. And I think, to kick us off, whole of society resilience means everybody has a voice and everyone has a role in preparing for climate impact. So whether that's residents, businesses, NGOs, local national government, infrastructure operators, because not one of us can tackle the challenges of climate change alone. So I'm really looking forward to digging deep into the conversation with Toby and yourself, Phil.
Cheers. Thanks, Karl. And well, that's probably the place to start here, is that you, as you rightly say, across the whole of society, there are so many different voices and actors, and we need to hear from all of them. And every voice in that conversation is entirely valid. But perhaps traditionally, we maybe haven't given equal representation to all voices. So I suppose the place I'd like to start is, and you've touched on it there, Karl, is how do we achieve that balance? So I'm going to throw that back to you to start off, actually, Karl.
Yeah, no worries. So whole of society resilience, I suppose the clue's in the name. It's about broad-based participation in all things resilience, and it means engaging with all stakeholders, and this includes when whole of society resilience isn't just another term for community resilience. This is about government agencies, local and national government agencies. It's about scientists, it's about businesses, volunteers, and it's about citizens. And we need to include within that those who are often marginalised or most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's really important to remember in the conversation that those that have done the least to cause climate change often bear the brunt of its impacts. So we need that collective, inclusive action across different sectors, across communities to really build resilience. And I think there's a big shift from the old top-down mindset. And what we need to try and instill is that sense of co-ownership in resilience decisions and actions, and collective learning across diverse groups. And one of the things that we'll most probably kind of repeat again and again in this conversation, that building of trust, that I really do think we've got a deficit of trust in society at the moment, which is something which is really important in my view, when we think about whole of society resilience. I'm really keen to hear from Toby and your work, and maybe your take on the role of trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think in my situation, in my role, I got a very interesting angle that I get to have a lot of conversations with residents, with businesses, and then with kind of large corporations and public sector. So it's a very interesting slice of the pie that I kind of get to be a part of or get to listen in on. And I think it's a very interesting one where when you have the kind of conversations around trust, it's quite clear. Kind of think you kind of hear about a lot in the news and kind of the lack of trust in a situation when a shock event happens. For example, if you've got a flood or a kind of major event, terror attacks, then the information that's being shared down often isn't received very well because there is that lack of trust up at the kind of up with the kind of high governmental level. So I think you're exactly right. Like, how do you build up that relationship so there is that trust at that foundational level? And I think a huge aspect of it is giving a voice to all the people, as you said, Phil. Then how do you do that when we got one organization, let's say you've got a council at the top where something's happened, trying to talk back down, but then you've got 1,000, 100,000 voices trying to speak up. How do you listen to each one of those and give them actual value and give them the time they need to discuss that? Is a really interesting problem. Phil, I don't know if you have any thoughts on.
Well, I think there's something here around the value of lived experience. I think what you've sort of touched on there, Toby, you know, the traditional approach is that we might see an organisation like a local authority, perhaps, you know, maybe engaging with scientists, engineers, to solve a problem, and that would use, you know, data, empirical evidence, and that is then presented back to those who are affected, as a statement of fact, and that is one voice. But actually, what we don't necessarily do is value or provide equal balance, perhaps, to those who have the lived experience. And there's a point here, I think, around storytelling and the value of storytelling, and how we can give time and space for those who have been impacted or who have local knowledge to really bring those valuable contributions to the table, and how we balance that against what is seen as fact, as evidence from scientists who use data. Karl, I don't know necessarily from your work in and around Manchester whether there's any sort of case study or sort of example of this idea of this trust deficit, or I suppose the counter to that, which is which I think was a phrase you used, Karl, which is co-ownership. So we've got two things here, haven't we? We've either got co-ownership or we've got that sort of trust deficit. And I'd be interested to see whether you've got a good case study of either, actually.
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of the communities that we've been working with within Greater Manchester, and the data we collected working with and alongside those communities, we found there's a lack of trust in public agencies, a lack of trust in terms of the work that they do. And when you get that lack of trust, people feel that they've just been left behind, and actually public agencies don't care. And I know from my work within local government that's not the case. That's certainly not the case. But that something's happened where that connection between communities and public agencies in some places has been lost. And I think that co-ownership point is really important, and co-creation is really important, but we've got to be really careful that these don't become just buzzwords. And it does take effort to co-create solutions, and it's not just a case of walking into a community space and then having a single workshop and then going, right, I've ticked that box, I've co-created something with the community. There's a need for continual engagement, and communities and those with lived experience, they may need time to kind of get their heads around some of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so you've got to give them that time. You've got to make them feel comfortable. And then you're gonna get some really interesting ideas and solutions. And it's how do you build in that participatory decision making or co-creation kind of framework within the work that we all do. And it's tricky, but I think I talk about sometimes trying to flatten those hierarchies of knowledge. And I think often we put certain voices and certain opinions above others.
Sure.
And actually, we need to flatten it. And that's not to say that the voices of within the community have all the answers. They won't, because they won't have the technical knowledge to be they may not understand hydrology, or they may not have that engineering experience, and they may not be a scientist. But also, they've got that thing called lived experience. They've got that local knowledge. They know exactly where, for example, their community floods on a regular basis, which may not show up on some of the flood maps. And it's how do you marry those things together, that technical knowledge, that scientific knowledge, with the lived experience, with that local knowledge. And then how do you foster that kind of partnership where the solutions are kind of co-owned, co-maintained, and then you get this wonderful position where the things are successful. The interventions end up being more successful because the community are on side, and it's been a co-created, co-developed initiative.
Yeah, and I think you're right. These phrases like co-creation, co-ownership, if we are not careful, it could become almost a little bit like the phrase resilience, the term resilience, which is it becomes ubiquitous, but we risk losing its meaning a little bit. What you touched on there, Karl, takes us to, I think, the heart of another topic here that we can explore, which is around community, whole society consultation and engagement. And Toby, I want to bring you in here because I know you've been doing some work on one of the flood and coastal erosion resilience innovation programs, the FCRIP work, which might put a case study perhaps to talk about. But thinking about how, as practitioners in the space, we can plan, design, conduct community engagement and consultation that allows the whole of society then to not only be heard, but to actively participate, so that, as Karl said, we then end up with a better solution at the end. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think it's a really important one, Phil. I know you and I talk about this quite a lot around bringing that engagement to the residents, to the communities, to the organizations that you want to speak to, asking them to come to you. People just haven't got the time, they haven't got the headspace. It's not something that's going to work really. Having the classic, having a community event in the church hall on a Tuesday evening isn't going to work anymore. What we've got to do is bring it to them. So Resilient Together is building a smart catchment in a kind of pilot catchment in kind of between Central Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. And it's a really good example of this kind of engagement where there's a couple of really interesting ones. One is they've run a World Cafe in collaboration with the London South Bank University, which is where they brought the community together, and it was a listening exercise. So it was an opportunity for the staff and those who have the kind of, the influence, I guess I would say, in managing kind of flood risk in the catchment, to come and not speak, to come and listen. And I think that was a really powerful activity to get to do, because how often do we actually do that? We often go with an agenda, we have a message to give, we've got lines to give, but actually going to them without any messages, without any lines, without any judgment, and just saying, talk to us, tell us about the chronic issues, tell us about the shock events, what's on your mind, what are the problems, what do you think the solutions are? And that's such a powerful way of engaging, I think.
It does, and it creates that safe space for people to feel engaged. And I've heard of some really good examples over the last year or two of, as you have said, Toby, turning engagement planning on its head. So let's not hire the village hall on a dark Tuesday night in February at 6 o'clock when families just won't come out. They'll be helping the children with the homework, doing the baths, or it's just too dark and miserable to come out. But actually going to places where community already assemble. So go to the park run on a Saturday morning, because hey, a lot of folk will turn out and they're there. And I think that's a really good technique, actually. And I love the idea of this listening cafe. Karl, I'd love to bring you in again on this point then, this idea of how we can conduct and plan consultation that just allows everyone to participate.
Yeah, no, and it's really great to hear from Toby around the listening cafe. I think cafes are they're the word of the year, maybe. But it's one of the things that we, and I fully agree with everything that's been mentioned earlier. It's that meaningful engagement versus a kind of checkbox exercise and going to the community where they are. Last summer we ran in one of the communities we've been working with, which is actually in Stockport. We developed a kind of community activation program, and we took over a derelict school which is owned by Stockport Council, and we turned it into what we called the What If Cafe. And that really was a place where any member of the community could come along and just sit down and have a cup of tea and leave if they wanted to. They could pick up some fruit and veg, have a chat with their neighbours, but also they could try to, and what we tried to do gently is try to get them to think about, okay, what could this space be for the community? How could it be of value? What's the future that you want to see for this community? And over time, over a period of 2 to 3 months, you begin to get some of these really great ideas, and you begin to then foster this kind of almost a slightly activist network of people who then want to go out and deliver things which are going to contribute to the resilience of the local community themselves. And that's where that kind of cultural shift comes in, because it has, there's stuff that has to be delivered by big agencies, big infrastructure projects, but there's stuff that can happen at that community level. And when we think about resilience, and when we think about when the shock events happen, it's your local neighbour that's most probably the most important person, or the people who you're close to, who are the most important people in at that immediately after that particular shock event. So this idea of a safe space where communities don't feel like they're being talked to, but where they're generating the conversation, they're generating the ideas, and then you can bring in technical experts to kind of meld and mold and kind of build upon and iterate upon those ideas with the community, and then you get something really magical, I think.
Yeah, that's really good. And it challenges perhaps that traditional approach to how we consult and how we engage, which probably would have been a deficit-based approach. We would have looked at what was important to us to convey and what was wrong in that community. What's the problem we're trying to solve, rather than thinking about what's important to them and what's strong. What are the strengths? What are the assets that are already strong in that community that we can build out from and create that sense of momentum, and build it around the sort of asset-based community development model, the ABCD model, which we're all sort of quite familiar with. And in a way, then this, I mean, it's brilliant the way this conversation's going. I'd like us to think then about those assets within the community, be they physical assets or social assets, but assets that exist, things that are strong within a community already that we can harness, and what role those assets can play in helping us to build that whole society resilience. And Karl, maybe you'd like to come back on that one first.
Yeah, I love that phrase. Instead of focusing on what's wrong, we should intentionally look for what's strong. So I think we're going to steal that. An asset-based approach is really important rather than a deficit-based approach. I think there's a danger that people parachute in solutions that have no community grounding, and actually building resilience based on what's already there and strengthening and connecting those local capacities is essential. And I think you touched on two of the things around the physical infrastructure and the social networks, and social capital is so important to resilience. I think I build in that kind of financial capital. You've got the kind of natural capital as well, which is really important in terms of the resilience of a space. To bring in another example from the work that I've been doing in Greater Manchester, there's a community called Higher Folds, which is in Lee, which is within the borough of Wigan. And it's it's a relatively isolated estate. It's got high levels of deprivation. But one thing it has in absolute abundance is community spirit, real community spirit. Right. And we found this really tight-knit social fabric there. They have really strong bonds and they look out for one another. And they've been flooded numerous times, and the community all comes together to try and support each other during those events, but supporting each other on their day-to-day challenges that they face as well. So, my role in working with that community is to kind of acknowledge that, support that, nurture those seeds, nurture those seeds and propagate those seeds, and then also to go, okay, what's worked and how can we spread those seeds to other communities, and how can we bring in ideas from other places within Tyre Folds. But that asset-based approach is really key, and we do always, I think some of the phrasing we sometimes we label whole communities as vulnerable. They're vulnerable. And do you think that community would like to be I don't know, kind of identified just through its vulnerability? I think and vulnerability does exist, but we need to be specific about which groups are vulnerable and to what. Instead of labeling whole communities as vulnerable, and we should instead be looking for what's really strong within that community and what can we build on. And I think that's where you get, that should always be the starting point and the foundation, in my view.
There's a lot to come at there with what you've said, Karl. In particular, these capitals, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But Toby, any thoughts from you on what Karl's just been discussing, particularly around sort of the use of community assets, etc.?
Yeah, I think, well, just to start, I think that stories like that, and you've got case studies like that, they're just it's really inspiring to kind of see where it's not necessarily the organizations that are the engine, it's the community that's the engine. And then, as you said, it's kind of nurturing or kind of guiding something that already exists and is there. And I think that's the fundamental thing behind a lot of whole society resilience. It's not creating something new. It's just helping to give a little bit of structure around these existing, I can refer to them as like hubs and links. So like having your assets, your things in your area, which are the things that are valuable, and they're there. You've got businesses who are desperate to reach out to their community and work with them and provide that social value, but they don't know how. And providing those links, and again, those links often exist already. You've kind of got business in the community, you've got chambers of commerce, you've got all sorts of places that you could be going to link up and connect with these organizations and linking them with those communities. So by strengthening those links and linking up the hubs, you suddenly create this network that was already there. The help is there somewhere. It's just about connecting the right people to create that resilience.
Yeah, just to come in on that, I think there's a danger actually in some of the criticisms around whole society resilience centre on is this just passing the buck to communities and government steps back and say, right, it's your responsibility, see you later. And I don't think that's the case at all. And it's not about government stepping back, but it's about governments and local governments and national governments' roles shifting to kind of enabling and supporting communities, and that means providing funding, providing information, and providing frameworks for then the local community to take those resources, that information, those frameworks, and run with it. And I think that so it's a shift really in terms of the role of local government rather than a stepping back.
Yeah, definitely. And I think infrastructure owners have a big role to play in this as well. I mean, Karl, you mentioned vulnerabilities to what I think is a really interesting consideration. And if you can create resilience in a society using this asset-based approach which we spoke about, if you can do that, that's fantastic. But if they are still vulnerable to repeated power outages because of vulnerability in the power supply, or there is a nearby flood alleviation scheme that is delayed, or that has had funding pulled, or they remain vulnerable to a certain flow path within the community, then actually that's where organisations, local authorities, the Environment Agency, etc., still have that role to play. So it very much is about alliances and partnerships between society and those agencies. I was really pleased as well, Karl, that you were talking there about capital, and the role that social capital plays within this, the role that natural capital plays within this, the role that human capital, and I suppose that brings me right back to that phrase of lived experience right at the beginning. But making sure that individuals within different communities have agency, that they have awareness, they have a degree of skill that can be of value when there is a shock to their community. This has been a really great conversation. I suppose before we wrap up, is there anything that either of you would like to add to any of these thoughts that we've had so far?
I've got a quick one that's a bit of a tangent, I must admit, but I think it's an interesting one. That it's a book I read a little while ago, You're Not Listening, by Kate Murphy. And it's all about kind of really interviewing and how you engage with people. But one of the skills that she described in this book is when you're speaking and when you're kind of conversing with whoever it is, and for us, let's say residents, or even potentially those with the assets that we're talking about, when you're listening, there's this approach of having in conversation a support response and a shift response. And that shift response is shifting onto the topic you want and to the solution that you're looking to get to. Mm-hmm. The support response is where you're taking what they're saying and you're saying, tell me more. Can you tell me a little bit more information about that? Can you give me a little bit more context? And I think an emphasis toward that support response in communications and engagement is ultimately how where we're heading with whole society resilience, is not just to take information, but to receive as well, as just to kind of take what's given to you rather than kind of seek out something specific. So I think that skill and moving towards that approach at communicating, I think, as lying at the very base of whole of society resilience.
Brilliant. Thanks, Toby. And Karl, I'll give the final word to you then.
Yeah, I suppose it's maybe I think there's so much more that we could discuss, and Toby's words at the end were fully agree with and were great. I think that the one bit that you've just touched upon, Phil, around kind of infrastructure operators and national government and local government agencies and partnerships, I think is something that potentially could be explored in detail in another conversation, because whole of society does mean it's about those national government agencies not working in silos and working together. It's about the infrastructure operators, whether that's water, energy, gas, transport, health, all of those kind of key critical sectors, how they work together to develop resilience. Because at the moment, and there's shoots and things which are happening which are really exciting, such as, for example, in Greater Manchester, there's the Integrated Water Management Plan, which brings together the Environment Agency, United Utilities, and local government. But there's not enough of that, and lots of individual agencies or infrastructure operators or private businesses have got kind of siloed risk assessments for starters. And how do we actually share those risk assessments, better share data between agencies, whilst also bringing it back to the topic of this conversation, taking that real people-centered, community-focused, place-based approach. It's been a fantastic conversation, Phil and Toby.
Thanks, Karl. And look, inevitably then, and you've alluded to it there, Karl, this is going to be one of those topics that we will add to a quickly and ever increasingly large pile of topics that we will return to, because we are just starting to scratch the surface of it. It's been really good. So look, Toby, Karl, thanks for your really great insights today. It's been a super episode. And so we have reached the end of our time together today. As always, if you've enjoyed listening, then please hit the subscribe button so that you're ready for the next episode in a month's time. Till then, thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.